Good afternoon. Hello, I am Melanie White, President of the Women's Club. Welcome to those of you in the auditorium, and a special welcome to those of you that are guests today. Welcome to our precious members watching online. As I searched for words to honor Veterans Day today, I came across the words of the Marquis de Lafayette. I do not need to tell the history buffs among us that we just celebrated Lafayette's 200th anniversary of his arrival at Rocket's Landing in Richmond, Virginia on October 25th. So I chose to quote Lafayette's words to the world today. Humanity has won its battle. Liberty now has a country. The online auction for the gala on Thursday, November 14th went live on November 1st. Check out the goodies that you can bid on to benefit the Bowling Haxel House Foundation. I'm taking a moment of our time today to talk about membership at the Women's Club. We need members to join us. Our Monday programs teach us, make us laugh, and bring the world to our auditorium. Our Monday teas allow us to personally meet each speaker and find new friends. Our Wednesday special events allow us to gather in small groups and get to know one another on a more personal basis. I ask you to share this enriching experience with other women in the Richmond community by asking them to become members. There is one easy way you may support our beloved Women's Club. We need new faces. Please ask your friends from other small groups you may belong to join us. If you're not comfortable asking other women to join us, then please share their name with our membership committee, and they will reach out to them for you. Ladies are sitting at the membership table just in the foyer to help you. Many thanks to all our volunteers today. Chair of the day is Janie Moyers, Vice Chair of the day, Megan Taylor-Shockley. The flowers were arranged by Sherry Sale, refreshments provided by the Scholarship Committee. And now, please welcome Janie Moyers as she introduces Catherine Grace Katz. Remember, silence your cell phones.
Catherine Grace Katz is a writer and historian from Chicago. She graduated from Harvard in 2013 with a BA in history and received her Master's of Philosophy in Modern European History from Christ College, University of Cambridge in 2014, where she wrote her dissertation on the origins of modern counterintelligence practices. After graduating, Catherine worked in finance in New York City before a very fortuitous visit to the bookstore in the lobby of her office in Manhattan led her to return to history and writing. She received her JD from Harvard Law School in May 2023. The Daughters of Yalta is her first book. I took this information straight from her website, GraceKatz.com. I had spent days collecting information on Catherine, listening to her book, and then I actually read her book, and then I read all the reviews of her book and listened to interviews with Catherine. And as I compiled all these notes all over my living room floor, I realized that nobody can summarize Catherine Grace Katz like Catherine Grace Katz. I don't want this to be a long introduction because Catherine is an excellent speaker and she has written one of the best books that I've read in a long time. It may be in my top 10, and it's definitely the only one in my top 10 that has footnotes, 50 pages of footnotes. And in her acknowledgement, she throws names around like Julianne Fellows, Allison Pataki, Professor David Reynolds, Justin Anthony Kennedy, and of course the Churchills, Roosevelts, and the Harrimans. I don't want to spoil the book by reading from the last page of Catherine's book, which will make you cry, but I'm just worried she won't have enough time to get to this particular point, and I think I'm actually setting the stage for you. So without further ado, a few words from Catherine before she actually speaks to us. Though Yalta was not the apex of Allied collaborations that many hoped it would be, for 3 women it was one of the highlights of their lives. In recent times, the presence on the world stage of elected leaders' children, especially their daughters, has become more commonplace, but in the era of Yalta, it was unprecedented. The post-war world would forget them, but they would never forget the chance to be their father's partners, protectors, and confidants, if only for a moment. Thank you, Catherine Grace Katz, for bringing history to us today on almost the eve of the 75th anniversary of Yalta. Welcome to the Women's Club.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you, Janie, for that incredibly generous and kind introduction. And thank you, Melanie and Margaret and Pat, who I think we connected about over a year ago about coming today. And I've been looking forward to this for such a long time. And I'm so excited that it's finally here. And I'm also especially grateful to have the opportunity to be here with all of you on Veterans Day. I think Pat and I had talked about a couple of dates and discussed how a Veterans Day kind of World War II themed program might be appropriate. And there are many people that you could have chosen to speak today, so I'm very grateful to be that person here, especially knowing I think you had Bunny Williams last week, and you've got Martha Raddatz coming next week, so I feel very fortunate to be in such company. But more than anything, just kind of thinking about the moment in time where we are now, 80 years on from these events, and thinking about how there are very few World War II veterans left with us. You know, not just World War II veterans, but all veterans and the families of veterans, just to take a moment to appreciate all of them and to appreciate their families. So if there's anyone in the audience today who's served or whose family members have served, thank you to all of you and to all of them, because it is truly the thing that is the greatest sacrifice of all, and that is what has been the key to preserving democracy and freedom around the world and in this country for so many years. So thank you very much. I like to start with this photograph, which is probably one that's very familiar to many of you. And it is one that is often on the cover of history textbooks. It is in documentaries. And it's one of the few pictures that we have of the big 3, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin all together. And it was taken with their advisors behind them in the courtyard of Levadia Palace in February 1945. And what I think is so striking about this picture is that you can see just how exhausted each of these men are and what a toll the war has taken on them. It is the sheer fact that they have been at war for half a decade and that they have now reached a point in the war where crucial questions are facing them. The Battle of the Bulge has just ended, and with that brings questions about the end of the war, especially the end of the war in Europe, as the race is now on to liberate Berlin. The 3 Allied armies all have their eyes on that prize, and there are fractures that are really beginning to show in this alliance between East and West. At this moment in time, one of the most important questions is what is to be done about the future of Germany? Should Germany be allowed to remain one nation, or should it be broken up into a group of smaller states in hopes that it doesn't rise up as a belligerent for a 3rd time in half a century? Also incredibly important to the end of the war in Europe is the future of Poland. Britain, of course, went to war in defense of Polish sovereignty at the outset. The Polish government has been in exile in London ever since, and Churchill does not want to return to London and look his Polish colleagues in the eye and tell them that they were not able to secure the very thing that they went to defend at the outset of this war. Stalin, meanwhile, has some other ideas when it comes to Poland. The flatlands of Poland and Ukraine have long been the pathway of invasion for invading armies going back to the Napoleonic era, all the way through Hitler. And Stalin wants to make sure that after all the sacrifices of the Red Army, that they are going to have friendly neighbors, as he refers to it, on their borders, that there's going to be a government in Poland that's going to be sympathetic to the interests of the Kremlin. Roosevelt, meanwhile, is more focused on the Pacific. Iwo Jima happens shortly after Yalta. They have not yet tested the atomic bomb to see if that will be an option, and so he's looking at the potential need for the ground invasion of the Japanese home islands, which could lead to the deaths of 200,000 American soldiers. He wants to, of course, save as many American lives as possible, and in doing so, he wants to potentially to grant some territorial concessions to Stalin in exchange for the Soviet Union joining the war in the Pacific. Roosevelt also has a loftier objective as he's starting to think about his legacy and what the end of his presidency and the war will mean for the future of the world. And he very much wants to succeed where Woodrow Wilson failed at the end of World War I with the League of Nations by creating an organization of United Nations dedicated to a lasting peace, which he doesn't believe is necessarily possible or practical to imagine an eternal peace, but he believes that it is vital to secure peace, especially in Europe, for at least 50 years. But in order to do so, he very much needs Stalin to sign on. Before I started writing this book, I just also did not appreciate what it took to physically get to Yalta. At this point in the war, Stalin recognizes that he holds more cards than do his Allied partners. The Red Army has boots on the ground firmly in control of Eastern Europe. And Stalin is also a paranoid person. He does not want to leave his security apparatus around him in the Soviet Union, and he's also very afraid of flying. But he tells his Allied partners, I can't travel, I can't fly, it's very bad for my health, my doctors advise against it, so if you want to meet, you're going to have to come to me. Roosevelt, meanwhile, is actually dying of congestive heart failure at the time, although this is an enormous secret that no one knows. However, there are some rumors. But Churchill and Roosevelt agree. These are incredibly important issues that need to be discussed. They must be discussed in person, so they are willing to make the Herculean journey all the way out to Crimea in the Soviet Union, the kind of journey that no advance team would ever allow their principal, like the president or the prime minister, to make today. For Churchill, this involves first flying 1,300 miles to Malta, where he'll rendezvous with FDR. And tragically, on the way to Malta, one of the planes carrying members of the Foreign Office expert team crashes off the coast of Italy, and several people are killed, which is really a harbinger of unfortunate things to come for the British. Roosevelt, meanwhile, has to make a journey across the Atlantic Ocean in a week-long destroyer convoy where they're still sighting enemy U-boats as they go. They rendezvous in Malta, and from there, they have to fly another almost 1,400 miles over enemy-occupied islands where there remain anti-aircraft units, which actually shot up the tail of one of the advance planes flying to Yalta, before they finally land in Crimea in a fog-shrouded airfield with a runway that is dangerously short for the kinds of planes that they're flying. And then they have to drive a further 6 hours over battle-scarred roads, sometimes at no more than 20 miles an hour, before they finally arrive at Levadia Palace. Levadia Palace was once the summer home of Tsar Nicholas II and his family, and it really was very much a family retreat away from the pressures of court life, where the Tsar and his children would swim, ride horses, play tennis. The Tsarina would sell her needlework at the local bazaar for charity. But of course, all of this changed in 1917 when the Romanov family was brutally murdered and the Soviets took control. The Soviets turned Levadia Palace into a rest home for favored Soviet workers, where people who needed rest and relaxation or a change of climate for their health could come and stay. But this property once again changed hands with the outbreak of war and the Nazi invasion into Crimea, where they used Levadia Palace as their headquarters. The Soviets managed to push the Nazis out shortly before the Yalta Conference, but not before the Nazis stripped Levadia Palace of everything they could carry. All of the furniture, the dishes, the lamps, the rugs, the art, literally down to the doorknobs, which they could strip out and use as scrap metal. The Soviets have a mere 3 weeks from the time that the three parties agree where they're going to hold this conference, which is, as Churchill says, if we had spent 10 years, we couldn't have found a worse location for it. But it really is the best of the terrible options available to them. So the Soviets do what they do best, and they throw manpower at the situation. They conscript Romanian POWs to come and clean up the gardens. They take the contents of glamorous hotels in Moscow, like the Hotel Metropole, which you might be familiar with if you've read Amor Towl's wonderful book, A Gentleman in Moscow. And so they cart the contents of the Hotel Metropole 1,000 miles south on trains. Many of the dishes and towels and linens are emblazoned with the Metropole's distinctive M. And what they can't get that way, they just simply requisition out of local homes. The Soviets truly do a remarkable job turning this palace that was decrepit and derelict into a site fit for one of the most important meetings in the history of the world. Unfortunately, they were not able to evict one of the types of visitors that had moved in the interim, this being bed bugs. And when the US Navy advance team arrived, they found it was a bit of a problem, so they decided to apply a healthy dose of DDT to their surroundings. Of course, we now know that probably wasn't the best idea. So that gives a little bit more context behind this photograph. It's always interesting. Sometimes I really get to laugh, and I don't know if I intend it to, but it is such a ridiculous set of circumstances that leads them to all be there, where you literally have latrines dug in the garden because there are not enough bathrooms for all the number of people coming to this conference, which is just incredible when you think that anyone would have agreed to this given who they were and the security concerns at the time. But it really does provide more context for this picture and just how exhausting this entire experience has been. But what I love about this picture is that it is one that is most fascinating in comparison with another picture taken of the almost exact same scene from a slightly different angle, just a few moments apart, where you can see actually off to the side are two young women. You have in this photograph Sarah Churchill, who is the 30-year-old daughter of the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and Kathy Harriman, the 27-year-old daughter of U.S. Ambassador to Averell Harriman. Just outside the frame of this photograph is Anna Roosevelt, FDR's daughter, who's 38 years old. You can see her on newsreel footage of the same scene. And this picture is so striking, and it was one that I had never seen before. And what made me stop and really think about this were two things. First of all of the people that these men could have brought with them to be their aides at this incredibly important moment in time, on the precipice between World War and Cold War, what was it that was so unique about their daughters' backgrounds, skills, and experiences that made them the perfect partners to be there with them at this moment in time? And perhaps more importantly, we have a tendency to put people like Roosevelt or Churchill up on a pedestal where they become almost more than human, and it becomes difficult to relate to them as human beings. They take on this kind of mythical sort of stature. And yet, at the end of the day, they're also someone's dad. And what would it be like to be their child and to be with them on the forefront of history? So before I get to introducing you to each of them in turn, I'd like to introduce you to another young gal. This is me in 3rd grade. I was very fortunate growing up in Winnetka, Illinois, just north of Chicago, that we had a wonderful program in our schools devoted to local history, where we had the opportunity to go and live like pioneer students for the day. You know, 3rd graders just like us in pioneer times, where we went to what was called the Pioneer Room, where we would kind of experience a pioneer school day, cook a pioneer meal, go out for a deer hunt, you know, things like that. Very charming Midwestern. And literally put ourselves in the shoes of people just like us who had come before us. And this was something that really stuck with me, especially because I was fortunate enough to grow up in a family of readers. My mom was constantly reading aloud to us. We read Little House on the Prairie, and this was my chance to be Laura Ingalls for the day. My mom read classic English children's literature to us, you know, everything. And some of my happiest memories come from summer afternoons where my mom would be reading aloud to us on the porch, or before bed, she'd read aloud to us again. And I think that just instilled in me such a healthy imagination and a love for telling stories. I was also very fortunate to have a close relationship with my grandparents, including my grandfather, who served as an officer in the Navy during World War II. He had grown up in eastern Montana before going east to Notre Dame, and then he went to Harvard Business School and did officers candidate school at the same time in 15 months, commissioned, and ended up being posted to a munitions depot that sent out the ammunition for D-Day. And I would chase him around at various family holidays, asking him to tell me his stories about growing up in Montana during the Depression, or going AWOL during the war to marry my grandmother. And those stories, I think, really stayed with me, especially because some of my favorite movies were things like The Sound of Music and White Christmas and The Great Escape. And so I think it came as a surprise to no one that when I grew up a bit and went off to college, I became a history major. This is me the morning that I turned in my senior thesis at Harvard, where I had 125 books checked out from the library, which my roommate, who I think set foot in the library maybe one time the entire time we were in undergrad, thought was hilarious. And here I had an opportunity to really engage with history in kind of a properly professional way, as I thought at the time. And to have my first experience really studying Winston Churchill, somewhat by accident. I had decided to write my thesis inspired by my love of The Great Escape, about British prisoner of war escape narratives and their place in British culture, kind of akin to the Western cowboy hero that we have in much of our literature. And I did not realize before starting on this project that Winston Churchill had actually written the first of what we think of as these stories of escape that really is a genre of its own in British literature, when he escaped from a Boer POW camp in 1899 when he was just 24 years old during the Boer War. And it was the story of his escape which really launched him to fame in Britain and jump-started his political career. And so I then had the great opportunity to fulfill a childhood dream of going to study in England. I went to graduate school at Cambridge, where I did my master's in history. And for someone who loves history, there truly is no better place to be. And just you're surrounded by history at every turn. And your mind can just come alive in ways that just, I think, by putting yourself in the environment, it's truly unlike anything else. And here I had the opportunity to write my dissertation about early modern counterintelligence practices and the postal censorship program, which the British government instituted to read all the in and outbound mail, the international mail, in hopes of finding enemy spies that might be lingering in their midst. And I, again, had a chance to study Winston Churchill somewhat by accident, because it was actually Churchill as Home Secretary during the First World War who oversaw this program. And so here I had spent 2 years very much immersed in the world of Churchill and things related to that, living in England, living out the historian's dream. And then for some reason, I decided to be like many of my friends from school and went and moved to New York and became a financial analyst. Trading in beautiful, idyllic Cambridge for this, which is just a little bit different. I think you could probably all imagine how that sounds. But had I not done that, I would not have had this very fortuitous experience, which really began to shape things that were to come in a way that I could not have expected at the time. I discovered that in the lobby of my office in Manhattan was this bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers, which was named after Winston Churchill's country home. And the bookstore specialized in books by and about Winston Churchill and his life and times. And when I just couldn't take the Excel modeling anymore, I would go downstairs, I'd pretend I was getting a coffee, but I'd really be sneaking into the bookstore to chat with the owner about history. I think he was somewhat amused. He didn't get too many 24-year-old female finance folks coming in. And so I think it was probably a bit of an oddity at first, but we became good friends. And a little time went by, and then I learned about this group called the International Churchill Society that was going to be hosting a dinner across the street from my office featuring Madeleine Albright as their keynote speaker. And I had never heard Secretary Albright speak and always admired her and her career and really wanted to have the chance to hear her. Unfortunately, tickets for this dinner were very expensive. I couldn't afford it. I said to the owner who was advertising the talk, "Do you think these Churchill Society people, would they need a volunteer to show people to their table or check coats?" And he said, "You know what? I bet they'd just be excited to have a young person who's excited about history join them." So sure enough, they very graciously invited me to come to the dinner to hear Secretary Albright. And even more incredibly than that, I had the opportunity to meet several members of the Churchill family. The Churchill Society is a group of academics and scholars, but also business people and doctors and individuals of all walks of life who want to encourage people to study Churchill, his lifetime's career, as a way of inspiring future generations to engage in public service, study history, foreign policy, and to go forth into the world with that in mind. And the Churchill family is very involved. Shortly after the dinner, I learned that the Churchill family was opening the papers of Churchill's daughter, Sarah, to outside researchers for the first time. And her papers were housed at Churchill College, Cambridge, where I had done much of my graduate dissertation research. And the family asked if I'd be interested in writing an article about her papers for this Churchill Society magazine called Finest Hour. And I said yes, just thinking it'd be a fun way to stay engaged in history and do a little bit of writing. Meanwhile, I had started thinking about applying to law school, and I will never forget walking down the street back to my apartment from my office one Saturday when I had to go in, calling my mom, telling her about this dinner, this chance to maybe write this article. And my mom said to me, "You never know how these things could perhaps take your life in a totally different direction than you never could have imagined." And I said to her, "I don't know, I'm pretty sure I'm just writing a little article that not many people will read, but it just is a nice thing to do." And she said, "I don't know, we'll see about that. And the moral of the story is always listen to your mom, because your mom always knows." One of the reasons, though, I was so excited about the opportunity to write this article about Sarah Churchill was because I had had an almost, I guess you could say, experience with Sarah from the time I was a little girl. Because my family goes to the cloister in Sea Island, Georgia every summer, and on the wall of the lobby is this beautiful picture of Sarah Churchill on her wedding day at Sea Island in 1949, where she had eloped with her second husband. And I'd always walked past this picture since I was a little girl and stopped and thought and wondered, what would it have been like to be Winston Churchill's daughter? And here was my chance to find out. If people know Sarah Churchill today, it's often that they think about her as her career as an actress, if they know her at all. She had a somewhat successful career as an actress in the 1940s and early 50s. She'd even starred in a movie with Fred Astaire called Royal Wedding, which came out in 1951. But I was immediately struck by her relationship with her father as something that was truly special. And I believe that of all the people in his life, aside from his wife Clementine, the person who truly understood Winston Churchill better than anyone was his daughter Sarah. And much of this was fostered by the long hours that they would spend together in the garden, where Winston Churchill was engaged in one of his favorite pastimes, which was bricklaying. He would be out there, yes, he actually was a member of the Masons League, I believe, for a while before it became politically inexpedient for him to be a union member. Sarah and Winston would be out there in the garden together for many afternoons, where Sarah would be out there helping him mix the cement, handing him bricks, maintaining the plumb line. And in those hours, they would spend talking, enjoying each other's company in contemplative silence. And over these hours, Sarah came to find that she was able to walk with her father in silent step, as she called it, that she could understand what he was thinking, even if he wasn't speaking. And that was something very dear to her, and that she carried with her throughout her life. She was also, I believe, one of the Churchill children who was the most like her father in temperament, in spirit, and ambition. If she had been born 10 years later, she would have been a contemporary of Margaret Thatcher, and perhaps she might have considered a political career for herself. But at the time, for a girl of her position and her age, there really weren't many professional opportunities open to her. So she looked around, kind of really wanting to chart her own course, much like her father, in some area that might be open to her. And she thought one way she might do this was by going on stage and becoming an actress. Of course, this thought would be entirely scandalous for many people of the time and of their situation. Winston Churchill was perhaps less scandalized than some, because his mother, the American debutante Jenny Jerome, was something of a scandalous woman in her day. She wrote plays for London's West End. She was rumored to have scores of lovers. She even was thought to have had a tattoo of a snake around her wrist. So just wanting to become an actress, a run-of-the-mill actress, was very tame compared to what he was used to with his mother. So he agreed, and Sarah became an actress, and a rather good one, and she made her way through, rose through the ranks, and very soon she fell in love with the star of her first show, a man named Vic Oliver, who was considerably older than she was and divorced, but he was also an Austrian citizen, and this was the thing that was very concerning to her father, because he feared that if the winds of change that were blowing from Europe really came to pass, as he feared there would, that there might be consequences for Sarah being married to an Austrian. But Sarah was in love, and she threw caution to the wind and decided to elope to New York. Winston sent his son Randolph off to chase her down. Unfortunately, it was too late. They married in a ceremony on Christmas Eve in City Hall, and unfortunately, the marriage quickly broke down. And the end of her marriage really coincided with the outbreak of World War II and her father becoming prime minister. In an effort to not only do her bit for her country, but also recapture her sense of self, Sarah decided to join the women's branch of the Royal Air Force, the WAFs, and she became an aerial reconnaissance photographic intelligence officer, where she would look at recon photos taken by pilots thousands of feet in the sky and make intelligence assessments based on them. She would look at ships in enemy harbors and determine what kind of ships they were based on the shadows that they were casting in the water. She would look at fields where there was trampled grass and ask if, was this an enemy troop movement, or was this some cows that were grazing in the area? One of my favorite stories about Sarah's work during the war came from a weekend that she had leave, where she zipped home, this time to Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, on a motorcycle, and hopped off and went up immediately to see her father, with whom she was incredibly close. And she found him sitting in his room at his dressing table, meticulously brushing the 2 or 3 hairs that remained on the top of his head. And he said to her as she came in the door, "At this moment in time, go sailing towards the Mediterranean, 542 ships. It's the beginning of Operation Torch." She says to her father, "Actually, I believe it's 543 ships. And he says, "How do you know that?" And she says, "Well, I've only been working at it for months." And he said, "Well, why didn't you tell me?" And she said, "Well, I do believe there's such a thing called security." He was somewhat admiring her cheek, but especially her success in her field, and he was immensely proud of his daughter and her contributions to the war effort. So he promptly went downstairs and regaled his guest of honor for the evening with the story of what had just transpired. The guest of honor that evening was none other than Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor was similarly charmed by this fatherly pride in his daughter, and she went and then told the story to the press the next day. Sarah then got back to base, was immediately hauled in front of her superiors who asked, "Who told this story to Mrs. Roosevelt? Who leaked this to the press?" And Sarah could only say, "I'm so sorry, but it's my father, the prime minister," and there's really nothing anyone could do about it. Early in the war, Winston and Clementine had decided that when he traveled abroad, someone from the family should go with him, really as a protector and confidant of sorts. In these very high-stakes environments, just having somebody that you could implicitly trust was invaluable. And for so many reasons, Sarah was the perfect person for the job. As an actress, her career actually gave her an incredibly well-suited background to diplomacy, where there's so much about the way messages are delivered and the things that are left unsaid and kind of the subtleties and nuances, where she was incredibly well-suited to a career in diplomacy. She also, as a military officer, understood the military implications of everything that was at stake. Sarah, much like her father, was also a beautiful writer, and she knew that her father would someday want to write memoirs of this war as he had after the First World War. And so the letters that she would write home to her mother would eventually become part of his record that he would draw from and the family would draw from to write the history of this time. But more than anything, I believe it was this close bond that she had with her father and the confidence that he had in her to understand what he was thinking, what he needed, and what the world needed at that time that made her really the perfect person for the job. She had the first opportunity to travel with her father first to the Tehran Conference in late 1943, which was the first meeting of the Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, as they were laying the plans for D-Day. At the conference, she acted with aplomb as a daughter diplomat, and others soon began to take notice of just how valuable a daughter diplomat could be, the first of these being the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, Averell Harriman. Averell Harriman was an incredibly dashing and debonair man. He was incredibly wealthy at this time. He was the fourth richest man in America, and he was the chairman of Union Pacific Railroad. He owned shipping conglomerates, manganese mines. He was one of the founding members of Brown Brothers Harriman, owned Newsweek magazine. You name it, he was invested. He was also the founder of the first great American ski resort at Sun Valley, which was really something that he dreamed up as a way to create demand for his train lines out west by giving Americans a glamorous destination to visit after they caught the ski craze from the 1928 Winter Olympics. It's really the first of its kind. He had two daughters, Kathleen and Mary, and he unfortunately was not very involved in their lives when they were little girls. He was often off chasing business deals, gallivanting around the world, playing polo, which he was highly adept. And he did not really come into his daughters' lives until they were teenagers. He and his wife had divorced, but sadly, his ex-wife died several years later, and he really came back into his daughters' lives at that time. And he wrote his daughters a letter saying to them, essentially, "I know that I'll never be a warm and fuzzy father. It just was not in his personality." But he said to them, "I do believe that we could become the best and the finest of friends." And he invited them to come and participate in his world of business to whatever extent it interested them. His older daughter, Mary, was not terribly interested. She was headed off to college. She had other things on her mind. But his younger daughter, Kathleen, jumped at the chance. She was so much like him in temperament and spirit. She was bold and daring and athletic. She was a crack shot, an expert equestrian, and an Olympic-level skier. She was actually the alternate for what became the canceled 1940 Winter Olympics for the U.S. ski team. And she jumped at the chance to work with him, especially in Sun Valley, where she would spend her vacations during college working with him, assessing slope conditions, helping to manage high-profile guests who came to visit, like Ernest Hemingway, even doing a bit of recon on other resorts that popped up in the area. And of course, she and her father would do what they loved most. They would trudge up the mountain on sealskins for one run down the fresh powder. Kathy, of course, in her very charming cashmere sweaters with her monogram on them, very stylish ski outfits, of course, until Averell Harriman instructed his Union Pacific engineers to create the world's first chairlift, which really made it quite a bit easier. Averell Harriman became very close with Harry Hopkins, who was one of FDR's foremost advisors during the Great Depression. And he actually decided to leave his world of business aside and go into public service during the Depression, despite having been a Republican most of his life, at the urging of his older sister, Mary Harriman Rumsey, who, after Frances Perkins, was the second highest ranking woman in FDR's New Deal administration. So he began to become very close with several members of the Roosevelt Inner Circle, especially Harry Hopkins. And when war broke out in Europe and FDR created the Lend-Lease policy, which I believe is one of the most brilliant aspects of his presidency, they needed someone to go over to London to administer Lend-Lease before the United States entered the war. And the person who was tapped for the job at Harry Hopkins' recommendation was Averell Harriman. So Averell Harriman gets to London and he decides, this is a great opportunity not only for me, but also for my 24-year-old daughter to come with me to be in London in the middle of the Blitz and to work as a war reporter. So off Kathy goes to London. She arrives after the night after the worst bombing of the Blitz. And she and her father quickly become very close with Winston Churchill and his inner circle and his family, including in particular Pamela Churchill, the Prime Minister's daughter-in-law, who's married to his son Randolph. And Kathy and Pamela quickly become best friends. Pamela, Kathy soon realizes, is spending lots of time with she and her father, not just because she values Kathy's friendship, but because she's also begun an affair with her father. Kathy stops and thinks about it for a moment and thinks, this actually might not be the worst thing in the world, because by providing some cover of respectability of the time that Pamela spends with us, because I'm Pamela's dear friend, she was able to secure her place in London, pretty much guaranteeing her father wouldn't send her home, even if things became more dangerous, because he needed her. But Kathy's work as a war reporter really opened her eyes to certain things that were being said about this prospective alliance with the Soviet Union that others maybe weren't so willing to listen to. One of her initial assignments was to cover the press conferences with exiled European governments, especially the Poles, who were warning that working with Stalin was not like working with other Allied partners. This is something that Kathy heard well before her father was really willing to listen to this. And it was an incredible insight that I think served her very well for the next number of years, including beginning in the fall of 1943 when her father was tapped to become the ambassador to the Soviet Union. Rather than going home, Kathy decided to extend her experience with her dad. She flew off to the Soviet Union where she learned to speak Russian. She really became she was able to interpret for him and act kind of as an assistant ambassador at times, but with her language skills and the trust that he had in her. And in doing so, she became the American woman who had more access to and experience with Stalin and his inner circle than any other American woman in history. And what is so amazing about this picture is that it's not just Kathy with a horse, but this is a horse that was gifted to her by Stalin at the end of World War II in recognition of all the service that she performed. When it came time for Yalta, Averell Harriman realized the perfect person that he wanted as his aide was his daughter, especially because she spoke Russian. Everyone knew her, they were very used to her, that she really was in many ways like a member of the official diplomatic corps, even though she didn't have diplomatic credentials per se. She really became something like a protocol officer at the State Department today. So they went off to Yalta as things are on the ground being prepared for the leader's imminent arrival. He leaves her in Yalta to oversee the finalization of preparations, and he jets off to Malta to go meet with Churchill and Roosevelt, and Kathy is the one who oversees the final preparations. The third of the daughters who attended the Yalta conference was Anna Roosevelt, and at 38, she was the oldest of the three daughters, and she was also the only mother among them. And her journey to Yalta is a little bit different than the others. I love this picture of Anna and FDR when she's a little girl because it's one of the few that we have of FDR standing, which is just something you don't see very often, and it was taken at Campobello Island, where they would go in the summers. And from the time Anna was a little girl, she adored her father. They had this very warm and loving relationship, and he really was, out there playing with his children in rambunctious ways, sledding with them, going on rides through their land around the Hudson River Valley. And he would take Anna with him out on their horses, and he would teach her about the flora and the fauna that surrounded them. And Anna's dream as a little girl was that someday she would grow up to become the co-custodian of sorts with her father of their home and their land in Hyde Park. Of course, all of this changed suddenly when FDR was diagnosed with polio. Suddenly, his world became very small, and he was surrounded by doctors and nurses and his political advisors, all of whom had to come to him. And this warm relationship that Anna remembered with her father was suddenly taken away from her. And now she was on the outside looking in, peering in through a crack in the door, never able to get close to him in the way that she had always loved. Her parents decided to send her off to school. They also insisted that she become a debutante despite ridiculing the system, which is something she really couldn't understand why they insisted that she do it. She then went off to college, spent a brief bit of time at Cornell, where she soon after dropped out and made a rebellious marriage to a man who was a good bit older than she was, named Curtis Dahl. They had 2 children, but it was a very tumultuous relationship, which ended shortly after he threw a kitchen knife in the wall over her head. And so they divorced, and Anna soon fell... Pause a moment on that. And she quickly fell in love again on the campaign trail, her father's first run for the presidency, with none other than a Republican journalist and employee of one of FDR's chief critics, William Randolph Hearst, a man named John Bottager. And I think that the story of their romance is perhaps proof that even in the most divisive of political climates, that love can still conquer all. So Anna and John got married. They moved out to Seattle, where they became the editors of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper. They had another baby, and then the war broke out, and John decided to do his bit for his country. He joined the army, shipped out to the Mediterranean, and Anna decided that rather than stay in Seattle on her own, she wanted to move home to be with her family, but home, of course, at this time meant the White House. So she arrives home in December 1943, just before Christmas, and she begins to notice that something isn't quite right about her father. He's sitting and staring off into space for moments at a time that they seem that he's just not quite all there. Or he sits there with his mouth hanging open as if he can't quite get enough air. His pen kind of draws off at the end of sentences. And these are things that maybe wouldn't alarm you if you saw him day in and day out, and these changes would be imperceptible. But to someone who hadn't seen him for a while, as Anna had not, she became very alarmed. And she soon insisted that he have a comprehensive medical examination. He finally agreed in March of 1944, and what the exam revealed was that he was in fact dying of congestive heart failure, which at the time was a very newly understood and poorly understood illness. And Anna was sworn to secrecy about his diagnosis. Eleanor really couldn't bring herself to see that he was sick. It just wasn't something that she could cope with at the time. And curiously, FDR himself never once asked what was wrong with him. You can imagine that as the President of the United States in the midst of a war, trying to bring it to its conclusion, any sense of your own mortality is something that you just are not quite able to grapple with. And unfortunately then, that burden fell to Anna to be the keeper of this secret. She also, unfortunately, was carrying the burden of another one of her father's secrets, and that was of his renewed affair with Lucy Mercer, who is a woman that he had an affair with when Anna was a little girl, and she could remember something had fractured her parents' relationship, and she didn't know until years later that it was this woman, Lucy, who now he was asking to see again. But Anna, in attempting to give him any slice of comfort in this world that was so stressful and challenging amidst now all of his health concerns, she was desperate to do anything she could to give him some measure of peace and quiet, and so she agreed to help him spend time with Lucy without her mother knowing about it. Anna took it upon herself to really become her father's gatekeeper, to help decide who needed to have an audience with the president and who could be fobbed off on somebody else for a meeting. She would even go so far as to take papers out of his inbox at night without him really realizing it, and helping distribute these to other people who could help to manage his burden. He really could only work for about 4 hours a day, and so it's incredible that he was able to achieve as much as he could on such limited capacity, but some days were better than others, and Anna was very much the one who was making sure that people didn't realize just how grave the situation had become. Even though FDR didn't know exactly what was wrong with him, he knew that Anna was doing something to protect him, and by the time of the Yalta Conference, he writes to Winston Churchill in January 1945 and says, "If you're thinking of bringing your daughter Sarah to this conference again, I'm thinking of bringing my daughter Anna." For Anna, this is all that she's wanted for years. She wants to recapture this closeness with her father, to be the person who's invaluable to him at the most important moments, and yet she knows that also by going, it means that her mother, Eleanor, won't be able to go. FDR doesn't want the fanfare of having the Soviets to feel the pressure of entertaining the president's wife, and so Anna kind of justifies it this way in her own head, and so off she goes to Yalta to be that person of the foremost importance to him, who he can rely on in the ways that she knows that she can be that for him. And yet she also knows that this is probably the last time that she'll ever have to spend with her father, just with him in this way. So it really is a very bittersweet moment for her. I love this picture of the three daughters together because it is one where you can really see each of their unique personalities coming through. You see Sarah in her military uniform with her well-coiffed red curls beneath her hat, Anna in the middle in a sensible tweed, Kathy on the end in a very glamorous fur. And I think that while there is so much similarity of them all acting in this way of kind of daughter diplomat, where they are not there officially as someone from the State Department or the Foreign Office, but they speak with the weight of their fathers behind them, which allow them to be able to deliver messages and nuances and come back and report back to their fathers about what they've seen and heard and discussed in a way that somebody official might not be able to do. They're also able to go out into the local community and meet some of the people in the Soviet Union whose lives had been pretty summarily destroyed by the war and whose futures are being reordered by their fathers in the conference room at that very moment. And I think it's so striking to think about, if any of us were there, would we have had the composure to be able to do what they did? I started working on this book when I was 27 years old, like Kathy. I published it shortly before my 30th birthday, which was the same age as Sarah, and just thinking how much I grew and changed in those years and what was expected of them in this incredibly charged environment is really remarkable to stop and think about. But I also like to think about their story and what it can tell us about our own world today, because I do believe that history is something that is, living and breathing and does inform where we've been and where we're going. And over the life cycle of this book, different things came to mind. I think sometimes we have a tendency to think about history and kind of the sense of applied history as looking at the past and deriving lessons from it, and kind of a one-to-one lesson and application I think we often see with something like Munich in 1938 and appeasement. But I think sometimes the lessons from history don't reveal themselves until events in our own times make us think about the past in different ways, and sometimes subtle messages can shine through in a very bright way. Some of the things that I considered while I was working on this book were things like, what is the appropriate role for the unelected family members of an elected official to have in their public duties? Sometimes we really want these people to be involved because they are experts in a particular way, and other times perhaps we don't want them, but can we draw a bright line? These aren't things that we had to think about for many years, because for many presidential administrations, there were very young children in the White House. More recently, with the Trump and Biden administrations, you see their children playing a much more active role, if not in policy overtly, perhaps more in public discourse. And it leads us to think about what really is the appropriate role for the family, while recognizing also that family is often the people that we go to for the moments where we need counsel the most, in times of self-doubt, when we need to build confidence, and kind of that implicit power that the family will always have. I also think about things like the founding of the United Nations at Yalta, and FDR's ambition for the United Nations is something that would secure peace in Europe for 50 years. In those terms, the UN has succeeded. Now we have something, perhaps has the structure of it outlived its usefulness and the way that it was structured initially, especially as you have certain members of the permanent members of the Security Council being so divided, and without really any prospect of that changing in the near future. And perhaps it might be time for some reforms along those lines. But more than anything, I've really thought about the relationship between Russia and the West, especially since the invasion of Ukraine. I started working on this book in 2017, so after the 2014 invasion of Crimea. And one of the most remarkable things that I read in my research for this was a piece of paper that I found in the Library of Congress, which was written by George Kennan, who was at the time Avril Harriman's number 2 at the embassy in Moscow. He was not invited to the Yalta conference despite being one of the handful of experts on the Soviet Union. But the new Secretary of State, who took office at the beginning of 1945, Edward Stettinius, sent a message to George Kennan asking if he could provide any information about the Soviet bureaucrats they would be meeting with at Yalta under Stalin. And Kennan writes back and says, unfortunately, I can't give you the information that you're seeking because I just don't have it. We don't have information about these people that's reliable in any way. The true information that comes out is only available then in their obituaries when they're no longer of use to anyone. And don't be persuaded that invitations to dinner and rounds of golf is going to persuade them to change their mind. Essentially trying to build this kind of person-to-person relationship, much like the special relationship that FDR had with Churchill and really believed that he could form with Stalin. Kennan's just saying, essentially, this doesn't work here and we need a different way. He goes on to write the long telegram about a year after Yalta, talks about trying to challenge the Soviet Union anytime that they seek to stir up instability or exploit fractured relations between allies, and trying to combat that at every turn because they only will recede with force and then go seek out some new area of instability to exploit, because there's really no deadline by which the Soviet mission of world domination has to be achieved. So it's always a resource preservation sort of mode of operation. And just thinking about these ways of conceptualizing the relationship between the Soviet Union or Russia and the West, I think is something that American presidents from FDR to Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden have really struggled with. And I think that there's much that we can learn about Russia and our relationship with them through understanding their history. And that's something that Kathy Harriman really had such a front row seat to observe and to understand. But more than anything, I think that there is sometimes this reluctance to feel that people can engage with history or that it relates to their own lives. Because what do we know about negotiating with Stalin across the dinner table? That's not something we can ever experience ourselves. But at the end of the day, history is the story of people and the story of all of us. And many people can know, well, everybody knows what it's like to be someone's child, and many people know what it's like to be someone's parent. And I think that those are the relationships that really are such a part of each of our stories, whether you're the average person or a world leader. And in that way, I think we can begin to empathize with and understand even the giants of history in a different way. And so for me, the story truly is one about family. And family is something very important to me. And I think no matter who you are, whether you're a world leader or any of us here today, that really shapes our lives in ways that often is lost in the stories of the grand narratives of geopolitics. And so that's something that has been very special for me to be able to share and to meet so many lovely folks along the way with fascinating stories of their own and such kindness and welcoming communities. And I just am very grateful for the opportunity to be here and to share their story with all of you today. So thank you. I think we have some time for questions. If you have questions, there are microphones coming around, and please wait for the microphone so the folks who are joining online can hear the question as well.
So this is a really cool story because it is these personal stories in a larger global context. Sounds like it'd make a great movie. You have any plans for that and anyone you might pull in to the project?
So this book was initially optioned by Amy Pascal before I'd written it, which was very exciting. And so she was Sony. Unfortunately, during COVID, things got very backed up, as all studios did. So I ended up taking the rights back, and now I am in the process of producing it myself, and then with a couple of other partners. And hopefully, movies take a long time. Development can take very many years. Something like The Queen's Gambit was in development for 40 years, so hopefully that won't be the case for this. But have gotten to know Julian Fellows, who did Downton Abbey over the years. He's been a great friend and mentor to me, and so working with him as executive producer. So hopefully the turmoil in the film industry will kind of even out, and we'll be able to make some good progress. So, yeah. Yes, so for the folks online, the question is, am I working on another book? Yes, I am. So I am currently working on another book in addition to being a junior attorney at a big law firm in DC, which is psychotic. I'm working on a book right now about the Hindenburg disaster in 1937. And it's the Hindenburg disaster, the rise of the Nazis, and the road to World War II, and how that event changed modern breaking news media as we think of it today. So focusing on the stories of some of the passengers and crew and two of the journalists who helped to share and to frame that story. And I'm very excited to share that. It's forthcoming from Viking, and hopefully we'll be able to keep working at a good clip so I can get that out soon, as there are certainly many parallels between the 1930s and today, which I think are important to keep in mind. Great. Anyway, well, I guess I was so comprehensive. You all have no questions at this point. So thank you very much.